Okay. So, oh boy. All right. Ugh, looks like I'm gonna have to adjust a little bit on the PowerPoints. So this is what I was talking about with good time management skills. You do have to have good time management skills to incorporate that study practice I was telling you about. But if you just try it, it's amazing. The neuroscience is proving it that that's the way to do it. As we are in class together, please ask questions if there's something confusing, because if you have that question, likely somebody else does too. And make sure to read the textbook. I have the postings of which pages and all of that, but sometimes hearing it in a different voice. So I didn't write the textbook, but if you can read something that's covering the same material, that can often be very helpful. I think it's a very good textbook. It's not jargon heavy. And, for a textbook, it's actually quite good. So they do have review questions in there, of course. And they do have some helpful material. Okay. Well, let's get into a little bit of anatomy. So plant cells and tissues. Right. That picture that you're looking at is a root, a plant root. So I'm hoping that by the end of this class, if a lot of you, are like, I don't know that much about plants. A lot of people who don't know about plants think they just kind of sit there and don't do a whole lot. And I'm hoping by the end of this semester, you'll appreciate much more fully how dynamic they are and interesting and how they are doing all kinds of things. It's just that they do it on a different time scale where we can't often see that unless we sit and meditate and stare at them for hours on end, right? The other thing too is a lot of it is hidden because it's all going on inside them, just like we have all kinds of stuff going on in our body too. And so plants are not just useful for us as humans. They are, well, we use them and are surrounded by them everywhere. And there's actually this phenomenon that's called plant blindness because we tend to ignore plants because they just kind of sit there. And so I'm hoping that starting with the anatomy, getting some basic idea of how a plant is put together and a little bit about how they behave physiologically, we'll get that kind of appreciation, and then we'll start branching out into macroscopic views of what a plant is doing. But first, let's go microscopic. Recognize this? From your toddler days, Magic School Bus? I used to love watching that. When they finally did a botany episode, a plant episode, I was so excited. I've been trying to brainwash my boys. Plants are awesome. Become a botanist. So they got it early on. All right, so the Magic School Bus, looking at plants and seeds. And so how I wish we could all do that. That'd be a lovely way to experience what a plant is like, is if we could actually go into the plant like this and look around. But we can't do that. So let's get into some basic anatomy. Plant cell, and this is drawn in such a way that I know that the artist was thinking about a mature plant cell. And the reason I say that is a mature plant cell that's done growing, the largest organelle in that plant cell is actually the vacuole. Now, if you took BI 111, which I'm sure you did because that's a prereq for the course, they typically say the nucleus is the largest organelle in a cell. That's animal. In the plant world, it's the vacuole. And that's really important because the vacuole is mostly filled with water, but it's got a lot of other stuff in there too. But what happens is if you have a well-hydrated plant, there's so much water in that vacuole that it gets so big in the cell that it starts pushing against the cell membrane, pushing against the cell wall, and allows the plant to fight gravity and stay structurally, upright and rigid. And so you need that so that it doesn't flop over and and succumb to the force of gravity. So the organelle that's the largest in the plant cell is the vacuole. So there we have that. And then they're actually showing there's a crystal in there. You'll look at crystals in lab, actually. And the membrane the vacuole has a membrane that we call the tonoplast. I would like you to know that word. The tonoplast, that's the membrane that surrounds the organelle. We'll talk more about the organelle. You can also see with a plant that there's lots of chloroplasts in there. Now, not every single plant cell has a chloroplast, so the artist must have been maybe thinking about a leaf when this was being drawn. If you're a root cell, you don't have chloroplasts, right? I mean, the sun doesn't shine down in the soil, so why bother putting chloroplasts down there? But up above the soil, you can find chloroplasts in many parts. They have mitochondria like we do, and the endoplasmic reticulum like we do. So they have a lot of other organelles that we share in common. But what makes them unique from animals is that really large central vacuole and the chloroplasts, which we'll talk more about those as we get more into the physiology of plants. When you look at the cell, you can see here that they've drawn the membrane, plasma membrane. I tend to call it the cell membrane. It looks like they've drawn it in brown there, and then they have the cell wall, which is the green structure there. So depending on what plant cell, you might have one cell wall or you might have two cell walls. So let's think a little bit about the cell wall. When you look at the cell wall and you come right down to it and say, really, what is it made of? What molecules make up the cell wall? When you think, or cellulose, which is found in the cell wall, it's just sugar, it's glucose. Okay, so cellulose makes up a large component of the cell wall. And these are just glucose units that are bonded into long chains like that. And it's kind of weird because glucose, it's not, you don't really think about sugar as being strong, right? But if you have them bonded together in these long chains, and then you put a bunch of these chains clustered together, then we call that a microfibril. So all these tannish dots that you're seeing, that's long chains of glucose that are clustered together. And then if you take a bunch of the microfibrils and cluster those together, then you get what they call a fibril. And that is what makes up a large component of the cell wall, is cellulose. So in that three-dimensional architecture like that, it does make it very strong. It's got good structural integrity in that way, even though when you come right down to it, it's just a bunch of glucose. It's the way it's put together. Okay, so my abbreviation for glucose is GLC. So it's just glucose, glucose, glucose. But you have to think more about the three-dimensional architecture, the microfibrils, clustering, and then the fibril. There's other stuff in the cell wall too. There's some proteins in there, glycoproteins. If they say glycoproteins, that just means there's a sugar attached to the protein. The glyco, that's what they're referring to. And then you see the cellulose, microfibrils. We also have pectin that's showing up. Pectin is kind of like the glue. It's very much analogous to glue, and it helps keep everything together. Hemicellulose is related to cellulose. Pectin you can actually go buy in the store if you ever made jams or jellies. Pectin is actually extracted from plants and sold for that. And that's what it does for your jam or jelly. It helps thicken and make it a little bit more rigid. And you can see that there's this three-dimensional architecture to the different components. Here's another view of that. So when you think about the cell wall, I think a good analogy is reinforced concrete. I think that is pretty good to think about. So if you've ever seen construction sites where they have the steel rebar down, so all those bars, if you think of those as the fibrils, the cellulose fibrils, and then the cement that comes in, the cement mixer, and then they pour the cement, that's kind of like the pectin that will help, get everything solidified and become the reinforced concrete. So that's a good way to think about it. So cell walls are very, very strong for the plant, and they have to be because they don't have a skeleton like we do. So they have to have some way to fight gravity, and the cell walls go a long way toward that. So here is an image of 3 plant cells. There's a few things going on here, but first I want you to look at the cell wall area. So here they have the primary cell wall. Ugh. Okay, the primary cell wall. So that's the dark brown area. And then you see that there's a secondary cell wall that is larger in width, that lighter tan area. Okay, so that is the secondary cell wall. So some plant cells all plant cells have a primary cell wall. And then some plant cells have an extra secondary cell wall. And we can see that that secondary cell wall is actually being built to the inside of the primary cell wall. And so all plant cells are born, so to speak, with a primary cell wall. And then some cells are like, yeah, I need to reinforce it even more. And so they'll start laying down a secondary cell wall. So I abbreviate primary with 1 with a degree symbol, and then secondary would be the number 2 with a degree symbol. So primary and secondary. So the primary cell wall has some flexibility to it. The secondary cell wall is much more rigid and strong. And when you look at the secondary cell wall, one of the components that's in that thicker secondary cell wall is lignin. You'll need to know that. So lignin is an extra component. Lignin you don't see in the primary cell wall, okay? You only see it in the secondary cell wall. And lignin is really, really strong. In fact, it's very complex chemically. They didn't figure out the actual structure of lignin until relatively recently because it's branched and big. It's a polymer. It takes a lot to break it down. If you've ever driven by a paper making plant that makes paper, if you've ever smelled that kind of weird chemical smell when you drive by it, those chemicals are pretty aggressive chemicals that they use to try to strip lignin out when they're making the paper. Because lignin, when you have paper, you don't want a lot of lignin in it. It makes it brittle. And it's just not good quality. So they have to use really aggressive chemicals to get rid of lignin because it's so well put together 3-dimensionally. The other thing that you saw, let me go back, in this image, between these 2 plant cells, you see these tunnels. And they don't even have it labeled there. That's interesting. So you can see that there's these tunnels that connect neighboring cells. Those tunnels are called plasmodesmata. Okay, you'll need to know that term too. So the plasmodesmata are these tunnels that connect neighboring cells. And excuse me, they're just open tunnels. They're not blocked by membrane. It just, so chemicals can flow freely through the tunnel from one cell to the next. Now they're small enough that you can't get organelles going through there, but you can get small proteins, you can get nucleic acids, potentially viruses can get through that way if they're attacking the plant. And so we call those plasmodesmata. Here you can see it color-coded a little bit better in pink in that image. So it's a way for neighboring cells to communicate with each other, pass information and chemicals, so to speak, through those plasmodesmata. And then we get into plastids. So chloroplasts, I'm sure you've learned about vaguely anyways. Now we have to think about more than just that though, because plants have more than just chloroplasts. So we have this umbrella term that we say plastids. So plastids are, there's lots of different plastids. Chloroplast is one version. And so the chloroplast you can see is kind of complicated. You have a lot going on here. You have actually two membranes that enclose it. So you have the so-called outer membrane, and then you have an inner membrane. So they often refer to it as a double membrane because of that. All right, so there's an outer and inner membrane. And then not only that, but all that green that you see inside, all of that inside, that's another membrane system floating around in there. Okay, so that entire membrane system is called the thylakoid. Okay, the entire thing. So if I were to look at that and say, oh, look at all that green in there, that green membrane in there, that whole thing floating around in there, all of it, you say the thylakoid. All right. And it's green because it has chlorophyll embedded in it. All right. So that's where we're going to zoom into when we think about photosynthesis. Chlorophyll's there. And of course, chlorophyll is going to be really, really important in photosynthesis. And we'll talk more about that. So here under the electron microscope, you can see what that membrane looks like. So you can see that there's relatively stacked regions of the membrane, of the thylakoid membrane. Then there's relatively unstacked regions. Okay, so that, the artist drew it correctly. It really does look like that. And so the membrane, that internal membrane like that thylakoid membrane is pretty complex. And there's a lot of things that are embedded in that membrane besides just the chlorophyll, because there's a lot going on when it comes to the photosynthesis. Well, here's another type of plastid, a chromoplast. So you'll be looking at these in lab. So this is a red pepper, the skin of a red pepper, where you take a really thin slice and put it under the microscope and you see those round plastids in there. If they have color other than green with the chlorophyll idea, we call them chromoplasts. Okay, if you look up the word chromo, that portion of the word, it's means color. So chromoplasts are, in this case, with red pepper cells, they're red due to the dye, the pigment inside. But you can have plastids that are relatively colorless. Amyloplasts, the only reason they look purple is because in lab you're going to do this. You stain it with iodine and it turns it purple so you can see it better, but really it's colorless. And amylo, if you look up that part of the word, it means starch. So amyloplasts are plastids that their job is to store starch inside of them. So we often use potato tissue for that, to look for amyloplasts, because potatoes have quite a bit of starch. And then alioplasts are another type of plastid, and we tend to use avocados for that. Take a little bit of the flesh of an avocado and look at it under the microscope. Alioplasts store lipids or fats, okay? And that's why you have these well, if you look at the avocado flesh, you can see there's a lot of the round organelles. I mean, it's just peppered in there. And so that's why, avocado tastes really good because it's fatty, but it's the good fats. So it's okay in moderation. It's fine. Whoops, let me go back to that. And so technically, you might hear someone say these are both examples of leucoplasts. Okay, leucoplasts. So amyloplast is a leucoplast. Alioplast is a leucoplast. Leuco means colorless. Okay. So they're just trying to say there's not much pigment in there at all. It's just colorless. Okay, so you'll be looking at those in lab. And then don't forget about the mitochondria. We have mitochondria too, but plants, they basically do respiration very similar to how we do it. They have to use oxygen like we do, and that's what's going on in the mitochondria, where oxygen is part of an electron transport chain process, and that's how the mitochondria is able to generate so much ATP in our bodies as well as in the plant. Not really going to talk so much about respiration in plants, but just remember, yes, they need to breathe, so to speak. They need that oxygen. They need to get their ATP. Okay. All right, so that is a little dip into the anatomy of plants, starting with the cells, and then we're going to zoom out from cells. We're going to go more macroscopic after that, but we'll start that on Wednesday. Okay, so we'll see you back here on Wednesday.